our attention. So and I think fund of funds, as they're entering into the sector, and there are a few very, very smart players that are just launching. I think it will be quite big, because fund of funds attract larger ticket sizes. They basically take care of the entire due diligence process that we discussed. They go through everything to make sure that everything is as robust as possible. That's why they're charging fees on top of as well. So those type of players will be very, very impactful.
Got it. So describe to us kind of two more pieces of the problems with the financial infrastructure, and then we'll get into what you're building. The first is the traditional banking system. Horrendous.
Yeah, I mean, this is very, in mathematical expectation, this is the fundamental reason why we're in this business, because it's something which people don't see and people should know. And let me describe you the following scenario. So you would have an asset manager and then another asset manager, and they've conducted a trade. Say they bought Apple shares. I mean, that settles T+3. So then the mechanics of that, what actually happened in the background, these guys have database, these guys have database. Both of them will have sub-custodians, right? They will have bank A as custodian for that asset manager, and then bank B as a custodian for that asset manager. So then actually trade needs to, the shares need to go basically from that custodian to that custodian. So the way it normally happens, it happens through Swift. Everyone uses Swift. So keep in mind 4 databases already in this equation. So all of these databases have software integrators and people who maintain it, and all kinds of software that needs to work together. And majority of those parts of the infrastructure has been built in 70s, 80s, 90s, so it's very, very old. So trade happens, and God forbid somebody misses a comma in MT500 message on the Swift. There you have it, trade stuck in limbo, not settled. Now, why is this important? Because a person at this asset manager, at this asset manager, at this bank, and at this bank spend half of the week figuring out how to sell the trade. Now, extrapolating into the entire sector, we're talking about 90% of costs of any financial institution is salaries, right? Like our salaries and all the expenses associated with human resources. So out of that, probably the most efficient places would have 40% doing that. Basically. So those are the most efficient places. Now, traditionally, I always give an example of a small Swiss bank, $1 billion, for example, assets under management / custody. They would have 25 people. Guess how many people would be doing this ops?
Out of 25 people, 15.
18.
Wow.
Roughly 18 people would do operations, and then you have 2 kind of mid-level, and then you have the rest of sales, basically.
Wow.
So Swiss salaries are not cheap. And why is this important is that it's not the banks that are going to save money. It's it's pushed to consumers, right? It's pushed to us. We pay for that. We pay all of this infrastructure costs. So we're talking about slashing everything in half, basically, by implementing something like this correctly.
Huge.
Yeah. So, and the database maintenance and infrastructure maintenance, we're talking about, for example, tier 2, tier 3 banks' budget for IT infrastructure is roughly around $3 billion a year.
Wow.
So imagine what kind of IT infrastructure budgets big players are having. This is not a big player. This is tier 2, tier 3 bank, right? We're talking about billions and billions and billions and billions, right? So and all of that can basically go away if you have a single source of golden source of truth. And that's why blockchain is important for financial infrastructure. There you have a situation whereas you no longer need to sync up databases amongst each other. You sync it up with the golden source. So that reduces cost dramatically. It allows you to be more competitive, and more importantly, it allows new players to enter into the field. Because, for example, when I started my career to launch a hedge fund, it would cost. Basically, the math would work out in such a manner that you need to have $100 million assets basically under management in order to basically pay for lights and salaries and things like that. So in September last year, when we announced our products, we were at HFM CEO Summit. The number that people discussed was 385 million. Now, how many fund managers do you know that can just leave BlackRock, Blackstone, and start a fund with $500 million?
Not very many.
It's very difficult. It's very, very difficult launching a fund. So we're talking about if those infrastructure costs are being reduced, then we have a much like fairer environment for starting a competitive environment as well. Regulations have to do a lot with that as well, because new introductions of regulations like been affecting those quite significantly. For example, in Europe, we had MiFID II, basically, which basically fell on last year. MiFID II, for example, requires you to submit 80 plus fields after each trade to the regulator.
Really?
Yeah. So all of this.
What the heck is in all that information?
Yeah, like who you like before it was 4, before MiFID II, MiFID I basically it was 4.
With the 4 is what? Who you traded with? When?
Yeah, kind of like
asset?
basic information, what assets, etc., etc. Now it's like everything, absolutely everything.
How many breaths did you take? What was your heartbeat? Where were you sitting? Right? Did you go to the bathroom beforehand or not?
Exactly.
Yeah,
the thing is, like, you end up paying more software integrators that would basically implement that for you and make sure that it all communicates.
It just increases cost and increases friction.
Exactly.
Yeah, got it.
And from the regulator standpoint, it's blockchain. It's blessing in disguise. It's something which can solve so many problems, but it's one of the situations where I don't think that they will just come out and say, guys, hey, we've built this, and this is how you use it. This is the GitHub. Like, let's go bug bounty, like all of that. Like, that's not how it's going to happen. You need to show them how this could be used. You need to build the tools and show them, look, guys, actually for the first time in history, you could be at the forefront of, preventing money laundering, terrorist financing, and things like that, because blockchain is actually not a very, very good, system to be, money laundering. Like it can be traced all the way back. And if you, and in traditional space, once you have it in a bank from cash to, that's it. Like you only know like the last point of entry. So for regulators, I think, and I hope, it's not going to be a quick process. We're talking about like years, maybe like 5, hopefully no longer than that, but potentially it could be even 10, where regulators are able to extrapolate like information that's happening and even be like, preventing and seeing those trades happen in real life, flagging those, and which will remove the costs from the players and create less frictionless and more competitive environment, which benefits everyone, all market participants.
I love it. And then there's this bridge between the engineers in financial firms and the finance people, right? They usually have very different backgrounds. They have very different perspectives. They spend their time doing different things. They almost speak different languages, right? I always joke and say one speaks the language of like GitHub and the other speaks the language of Excel. Yeah,
absolutely.
Right? And so they're working on, in the same company, they're working on the same problem, just very different ways. How big of a problem is that, and how big of a gap is there between those two groups? Huge.
To give it to quantifiable numbers, like in 2015, everyone got excited about fintech. Remember, like big data, fintech is going to change the world and everything. And then a bunch of banks and large institutions started like projects, like pilot projects, or some of like not pilot, like full scope projects. And 90% of those projects failed. They failed because of that reason, because of lack of understanding between those two tribes. And we're talking about like top 5 largest banks in the UK. They had a project that they spent $500 million on, so 500 million, and they didn't launch it because they couldn't migrate the database.
Really?
Yeah. So database migration basically is a significant portion of failed launches, because the project is built, but then it comes to migrating, and the migration takes such a long time that the project kind of like dies halfway through. And we're talking about like banks and large institutions, they'll realize that problem. Like, for example, one of the top 10 largest banks in the world, for example, today uses syntax called COBOL in their core banking system. So they lost documentation to what the core banking engine does, roughly in like early 2000s or like mid 2000s, and had to write a PHP wrapper around to understand what the core banking basically system does. And COBOL been used widely in financial services, and this is syntax developed by American military in the 70s. And people who know COBOL either retired or dead, and lots of guys basically coming out of retirement because the money that people pay to patch now those systems are ridiculous. And we're actually seeing a few engineers that start to learn COBOL, because we're talking about like Java consultant would getting paid like the rate is about £800, so $1,000 a day, and COBOL is $2,500, $3,000 a day. you can get paid $3,000 a day to patch the system written in COBOL. So within the final, like the reason why it still exists is because it's such a massive machine that needs to migrate from one to another, and then engineers can build it. The migration needs to be performed kind of like with joint efforts, and it always have, because it's not uncommon to have like 2, 3, 4, 5 years integration cycles of the software in large institutions. Doing complete from the ground up, like rejiggling of the entire systems, is borderline impossible. And that's why also from where we're going with the whole financial infrastructure based on blockchain, I believe that we're not going to see large institution coming in and saying like, look, we built everything, thanks very much. It's either going to be through acquisition or it's going to be completely new from scratch. And keep in mind the budgets of the IT infrastructure. These guys can afford to basically drop $1 billion on a company that built something.
Yeah, just no problem.
Like this.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're talking about like traditional space, for example, from the investing standpoint, you have like VCs that need to sell to Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Google, et cetera, et cetera. How many financial institutions can buy a startup in this sector? Like huge number. And they're all
almost all of them.
All of them, exactly. So it's going to be pretty exciting to see how this will unwrap and how this is going to be integrated. But the future of financial services is most certainly will be based on blockchain.
What are you guys doing?
When it comes to infrastructure.
Yeah.
So custody is the first point, basically. We rebuild.
Name of the company, who you started it with, and then what you guys are doing.
So we're called Copa. So we started the company because we couldn't find suitable institutional infrastructure service providers in crypto space when we structured the fund. And we did structure a fund. Basically, we went prospectus, administrative, everything's done. Started to look out for custodians, found wallets who then didn't realize they were custodians, and this is, well, then they basically changed their branding to custodians. But then I was trying to explain to the guys, like, look, I can't pay you withdrawal fees. I'm charging $330 like management performance fee, which is already like should be illegal, but the clients are happy to pay for it because the assets going like 100% every 2 months or so. So, but I can't pay you withdrawal fees. That's insane. So, anyway, long story short, we didn't launch the fund. We shut it down because we couldn't find infrastructure. The decision was made that it's an opportunity, right? So inefficiency equals opportunity. So we started building custody for buy-side players like we spend our careers being. So we built custody product. We built it a little bit different. We didn't build it in such a manner like, this is crypto, this is where it's stored. Yep. Crypto on our custody platform is stored basically because it's not like a gold bar. You don't need a mountain to store it. Like it's stored using cryptography, so in mathematical expectation. So you don't have to have somewhere stored at all points in time because it creates unnecessary vulnerability. And then we threw it off basically completely offline, no connection with the online layer, and just sits there. And when you need to sign transaction, we use basically optical air gapping, so it generated QR codes to pass the information between devices. So then we started developing this, and we built a framework called Walled Garden, which solves that problem of having predefined ecosystem of execution venues where a manager can transfer the crypto and nowhere else. And which gives a massive comfort to LPs. Basically say, we don't have access to anything, Copa is handling, Copa doesn't have access to anything, no one has access to anything, but it works. And the Walled Garden framework basically went live earlier this year, like in January. And then we also looked into OTC market, and we started looking at everything is kind of like settled bilaterally. And whereas it's all exciting to have like smart contracts settling the trades and everything, it doesn't exist yet. And today it's not uncommon to see a trade being settled in 2 weeks. So, I mean, it's just crazy. I mean, we're talking about T+3, T+2 inefficiencies, and we're talking about like, within the crypto community, people discussing like how to scale the, to process, the blocks instead of like, 20 minutes in 2 seconds, but trades are settled like in 2 weeks. So that's crazy. So we built a settlement framework and clearing framework for institutional players so they can settle basically through us. And the development of all of that is basically exactly what people are used to in traditional space. For example, prime broker and prime brokerage service is going to be super important in the space because people can utilize the tool provided by prime brokers to use their capital that's been given to them by LPs more efficiently, i.e. generate more return, i.e. more money coming into the space. So it all kind of makes sense. And We're talking about margin funding, lending, borrowing, repos, reverse repos, collateral rehypothecation. So all of these terms, I mean, I know that they might be confusing for some of the audience, but those are basically the tools where, for example, you can borrow with a promise to buy it back at a certain price later at a certain date. It allows you to create different strategies, different hedging strategies where, if you're winning on one leg, you're not going to lose on another leg, and things like that. Or collateral rehypothecation is, for example, whereas you store your funds with the prime broker, and then those funds are being lent to someone else, you're getting a cut off those fees that they charge, basically a borrower on the other side. So all of these parts of infrastructure are super important, and it's still early days. I mean, it's institutional space is ridiculously small. We have a lot of interests, kind of like, and obviously you guys on your side speak with big institutions, but you know how careful they are, how it takes 6 to 12 months to get somewhere. And the first kind of group of people that went out is like the crypto funds. And there are probably 20, 30 like crypto funds out there in the world with proper strategy, institutional background, understanding how to conduct investment activity, and these guys were going to dictate basically how this sector is going to grow, because they are the contact for their LPs, and LPs have all the money which they basically take from Goldman and put into them. That's the
game.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. What talk a little bit more about how the LPs drive decision making.
Absolutely. I mean, so we covered that a little bit in terms of who are current LPs and what kind of tickets they're writing. But as part of the due diligence for some of our clients, as most of our clients, they basically ask who's your custodian, what is the walled garden framework, how it works. So we end up talking to them, and we end up talking with
the custody provider. As
the custody provider, yeah. It's a new space. They want to make sure that how this works and
make sure you're real.
Exactly,
you're doing it the right way.
Exactly. And these are very, very sophisticated guys, and it's not a matter of like, whether they want to invest, it's how much they want to invest, because it's a risk return for them. So they weigh the risks by conducting the full due diligence of a cycle, etc. And keep in mind, like execution venues today are places like BitMEX, etc. So they're also
not exactly the most institutional friendly places.
Exactly, but it's a true reflection of the crypto space today. So at least we have kind of that's it's basically super efficient, in terms of like where we are, what we're doing, etc. So, going forward, it's either these guys will adjust and make sure that they tick all the boxes for institutional guys to have the flow from them, or someone else will do it. Someone else will here, UK, whatever, wherever, we'll sit down, build a derivatives exchange, properly regulate it, and then get the flow. So. But it's good to see like many companies like coming into the space and providing all of these different services, like driving efficiency even forward. So it's I think it's a good thing.
Where do you think we still have to improve, right? Like what are the next kind of steps, and then what's the future of kind of custody, prime brokerage, and other financial infrastructure for the crypto industry?
I think it's always like I've got a technology finance background, and I think where the most stumbling blocks always are, it's when you try to build something straight away for 2035, and like it's like you build a wheel like Lamborghini wheel, and like bring it, and there's like a cart outside, so it's like I think those components should kind of like be stacked with each other in such a manner that we have MVP and we move to MVP 2.0, etc., and then we have alpha, beta, and blah 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 blah, and we basically go with what works today, what solves the problems today, rather than solving hypothetical problems somewhere down the line in the future. So then, I mean, that's what we're doing. That's what some of the other players are doing in the space. So I think it's so when everyone got excited about like end of 2000 institutions coming next year, like we were that institution. We're like, this is not happening. Like we can't. Like
the desire was there, but the infrastructure wasn't.
Yeah, exactly. So we're now seeing first proper institutional launches, like from Q1 this year. Like that's bigger ones pulled the plug when. But also, by the way, what was blessing in disguise is when Bitcoin went from 6,000 to 4,000. we saw basically, so our conversation is like 50-50 chance basically that you're going to sit down and have a proper conversation with a potential client, or you would have a conversation of like somebody who's managing like, $20,000, and like the guy bought Bitcoins like in 2010 and now he's a fund manager. And for us, like it eliminated all of them basically. So the guys who stayed in the sector, they know exactly what they invest in, they know exactly how they invest in, they know exactly how to communicate the investment strategy.
The tourists went away.
Yeah. Sorry?
The tourists
exactly.
went away.
Yeah, tourists, yeah, correct. Yeah, absolutely. And that was absolutely great. Like, so everyone kind of like who went through this, and by the way, no one was kind of like second guessing it. Mm-hmm. Like everyone just like kept doing what they're doing, and they're like, okay, we're like on target to launch that, and then, all the variables aligned, all of the, money are lined up, let's do it. And then people do it. So it's great to see the first kind of like conductions happening
For
this
sure.
year.
What before I finish up, I always do rapid fire questions. What do you think is the most important company in crypto?
I think it's not one company. I think it's a consortium, and I think it's when it comes to spreading the word and the media. I think media in
Oh, interesting. You think the media is the most important?
Absolutely, because without the media, we wouldn't see the responses from regulators wouldn't care, like some other players wouldn't care, like some people wouldn't be thinking they're missing the boat, some people wouldn't spend the time. So it's kind of like content, and it's like you create liquidity, like you're a market maker, and then there's like on the other side there is a taker, and then people have to react to it.
And it's like the media is basically a liquidity provider of information.
Exactly. And without,
that's a really interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, and liquidity is basically the key. Liquidity is your oxygen. Mm-hmm. So, and then the space, for example, people would just dismiss it and say, okay, well, no one cares about it. But when you have like Cointelegraph, CoinDesk, Bloomberg, FT, everyone's basically writing about it, you kind of understand, okay, well, it's time to look into it.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. What about regulation? What one regulation would you change or improve if you could?
It depends which kind of like place we're talking about. So everyone's got like all sorts of things. So for example, in this country, I would say Howey definitely. So
okay, U.S. Howey test.
Yeah, and just generally judging things by the way they were done. Because it's this market been in existence like the longest, right? So, but judging like the same way as we would be judging like activities like 50 years ago, so shouldn't be the case. In the UK and Europe, I would say RDR. So RDR is basically what you can sell to retail clients.
Okay.
Because retail end up with sub